Class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be doing a bit of an update on some of these Sharks prospects over this season. It's been a bit of a crazy year in general. Obviously, the NHL was forced to do a shortened 56-game season with a playoffs bracket to follow that, but the NHL also has a ton of capital, a ton of money flowing in, and so they were able to afford to just go a bit of a shortened year compared to some of the other, lesser leagues around the world, like, junior leagues or the AHL. These were leagues that didn't have as much money and so were forced to go with even shorter seasons and potentially even no playoffs. So starting off, we have Ozzie Weisblatt, who was the Sharks' first-round pick last season that came from the Tampa Bay Lightning in the Barclay Goodrow trade. And of course, since the Lightning ended up winning the Stanley Cup that season, this pick ended up being 31st overall and the last pick of the first round. Ozzie Weisblatt, 23 games played, 7 goals, 21 assists for 28 points in the WHL, as I said. And WHL had played a very shortened season, I believe 26 games, and didn't actually have a playoff, so Weisblatt wasn't able to really show off a ton, but still, over a point per game, which I guess for a draft plus one player is to be expected. Nothing that was necessarily blowing anybody away. However, it should be noted that Weisblatt, in the end, after that junior season concluded, came over to the Barracuda and actually performed decently well through his first professional games of his career. In the 6 games he played with the Barracuda, getting 2 goals and 1 assist, which certainly isn't all that bad. Nice to see that, and hopefully, while we won't likely see Weisblatt in a Sharks jersey next season, hopefully he can continue to develop and maybe an arrival in the 22-23 season is possible. Next, let's talk about Jonathan Dahlin, who has been acquired. He's bounced around. Then he was playing with the Barracuda at a time. Then he moved over to Sweden to play a couple of years there in the Sweden second-tier league. But now it is rumored that he will be returning back to North America, back with the Barracuda, and we will see how he does in the Swedish second-tier league. He had 45 games played, 25 goals with 46 assists for 71 points. This was by far the leading scorer of that second-tier Swedish league in terms of points per game and just in terms of points in general. But it obviously should be taken with that grain of salt. This was, as I've said, the second-tier Swedish league, and even the first-tier Swedish league is pretty far behind what the level is at the NHL, and I would assume that the second-tier Swedish league is probably even behind the level of the AHL, and so we should not necessarily be expecting Dahlin to suddenly come over to North America and light things up and be a first-line player for the San Jose Sharks, and it just seems as though he'll probably start to fit in with the Barracuda, though, unlike with Weisblatt, it is technically possible that Dahlin will get a game at some point next year in the NHL. I guess we'll see how he does at first at the AHL level. I just wouldn't necessarily get your hopes up a ton just based on his point totals in the Swedish league, just because of the fact that things are very different across the sea. Next, we'll be talking about Thomas Bordello. He was also drafted this past year. He was just a few picks after Ozzie Weisblatt, as of course Weisblatt, because it was the Tampa Bay's first round pick. It was the final pick of the first round, and yet it was the Sharks' actual second round pick, and so it was one of the first picks of the second round. So in the end, these were only separated by a few choices. And Bordello has actually exceeded expectations for the San Jose Sharks. Has had a very successful year at the NCAA level, was the leading scorer for his team, the University of Michigan. 24 games played, 8 goals, 22 assists for 30 points, was actually 12th in the entire league in terms of points per game. He would have hopefully had a pretty decent showing at the World Juniors if he didn't have a sort of COVID situation go down and ended up not being able to play. However, he was still very impressive at the college level, and while he is committed to playing college next season, so we will not see him with the Sharks, hopefully that development can continue, and similar with Weisblatt, we'll be able to see him a couple of years down the line. Next is Artemi Kniazev, the first defenseman on this list. He was the Sharks' first pick in the draft 2 years ago, as the Sharks did not actually have their first round pick that season, and so this was their second round pick, though still their first pick in the draft in general. Kniazev played at the QMJHL level this season, 14 games played, 5 goals, 13 assists for 18 points. The QMJHL, unlike the WHL, did indeed have a playoffs. He played 9 games there and was a point per game player, 9 points in those 9 games. And unless he actually ends up being an overager at the QMJHL level next next season, which is technically possible, he should be with the Barracuda next season. Would we expect to see him with the San Jose Sharks? It's pretty unlikely unless a Nikolai Knyzhov situation actually occurs during training camp, but it'll be nice to see Kniazev come over, get some of those professional games under his belt, as he is a semi-promising offensive defenseman for the Sharks. Next, moving on to a bit more professional type of players, maybe a bit closer to the edge there. Jaden Halbega-Watts was one of the Sharks' one of the Barracuda's leading scorers in terms of players who didn't end up playing a game with the Sharks that season. You take a look at the players ahead of him like Blichfeld, Chmelevski, Shellman, Alex True. All these players got at least a game with the Sharks this season. Halbega-Watts did not. And Halbega-Watts has been, with the Barracuda for a few years now, and it always seems as though he's been on the cusp of being able to make it to the Sharks roster, but just hasn't really been given the opportunity. But this wasn't that fantastic of a season for him. 25 games played, just 6 goals, 5 assists for 11 points. Obviously, this was a bit of a weird season, so it's hard to judge too much about how these players actually performed, but still, as a smaller forward, you want to be able to rack up those points because that's really the main thing that you're bringing to a roster when you are a small forward like that. You take a look at a player like Johnny Gaudreau for the Calgary Flames. He's not some sort of physical type of player who gets in the corners and works for pucks. He's a speedy type of player who, is trying to score goals, trying to score points, and that's exactly what Halbega-Watts had to be, but it wasn't so much this season, so I wouldn't be surprised to continue to see him at the AHL level next season, and we'll see if maybe he can finally take that next step. And finally, let us talk about the notorious Ryan Merkley. He was drafted a few years ago now at the 2017 draft, if I am not mistaken, and during that draft, he was extremely hyped up as a very, very skilled player, but he had dropped down to where the Sharks were picking around 20th overall because of his attitude issues on and off the ice, as well as some defensive issues. But as I said, he was so hyped up, people were saying that besides Rasmus Dahlin, who was the first overall pick that season, that Ryan Merkley seemingly was the most skilled defenseman of that year's draft. So technically the second most skilled defenseman of that year's draft. And yet the issues haven't necessarily solved themselves. It was a bit of a gamble at the time for the San Jose Sharks picking Ryan Merkley, and it hasn't necessarily paid off just yet. While those attitude issues seemingly have solved themselves, at least, off the ice issues, we don't exactly know what's going on, but there haven't been any crazy stories or anything. And the on-ice issues as well, as before, a few years ago, he was a pretty penalty-prone type of player, took a ton of penalties. This year, he definitely, laid off in that a bit, was a bit more disciplined. However, in terms of his defensive issues, those definitely still remain with him. He was the highest minus player on the San Jose Barracuda this season, and the general sense that you seem to get from when the coaches and GMs and management talk about him is that while they use all this very soft language and nice language, the general sense is that he's not really ready to play an NHL game just yet. And you can really tell by how the Sharks were working this season. There were a rotating cast of players that were able to get a Sharks roster spot for the defensemen this season. Greg Patterin, Frederick Claesson, Christian Jaros, Nicholas Milosh, Jacob Middleton, Brinson Pasterschnuck, all of these players getting at least a game this season, and Ryan Merkley, who you would think would be a candidate to be able to get at least a game, it just didn't end up happening. And so coming into next season, like I said with Kniazev, unless there's some sort of Nikolai Knyzhov type of transformation at training camp and Ryan Merkley blows everybody away, it is likely that he will just get an expanded AHL role this next season, where he will likely be, a top 2 defenseman for them, and we will really see where Ryan Merkley will land. We thought that this past season was going to be a make or break year, but because of the COVID situation, it didn't really end up being the case. Ryan Merkley only with the 31 games played, 1 goal, 10 assists for 11 points. But next season, where hopefully we will have a full AHL schedule and everything will get back to normal, I think that will probably be the year that decides where Ryan Merkley is going to go with his career. Will he do extremely well and set himself up for an NHL career in his future, or will it continue to be sort of subpar, not so great, maybe at best mediocre, and then he maybe just won't ever go anywhere? But that will do it for this prospect update. Clearly, just by my feelings about these 6 players who I've outlined, the Sharks' prospect cupboard isn't necessarily filled to the brim with promising players. Besides players like Bordello, who seemingly has a chance, and then players like Weisblatt or Kniazev, who could potentially have a chance as well. It seems as though that the Sharks are lacking in terms of this elite young talent. However, with the upcoming draft in a few weeks, and the Sharks guaranteed to have at the very least a top 10 pick in that draft, and potentially with a chance to move up as the draft lottery is coming up in a couple of days, the Sharks will hopefully take that opportunity to restock their prospect cupboard and maybe get a bit of a brighter future for themselves. Class dismissed.